Hi everyone, it's Ms. Sheehan, and today I'm going to do a lecture on two of the dynasties of the Chinese Empire, the Tang and the Song. Okay, and I would like you to take notes on this. You do not have to write every single word down, but you should write down what you think is important and then any major vocabulary. Okay. So these are just a couple of vocabulary words. I'm not going to go over them, but you can come back to them as needed, right? So a big one here is tributary state, which is kind of like a version of empire. It's an independent country, so it's not been entirely conquered by an empire, that has to acknowledge the supremacy of another state and pay tribute, money or resources or trade to its ruler. So it's basically they like give stuff to the ruler in exchange for that empire or country not conquering them. And that was a common thing that China did with the places around it. Okay, a couple of other pieces of vocab if you need it. Okay, so the Tang and the Song dynasties brought unity and cultural achievement to China. They were two of the major dynasties, and they're often known as the golden ages of the Chinese Empire. Each of them lasted around 300 years, so very long-lived dynasties, and created growth in the economy and order in society. So together they account for about 600 years of a unified China, which, as you read about, was kind of unusual, right? That the unification of what was then China could last for that long. Okay, so the Tang dynasty started in 1618. Li Yan crushed his rivals and became the first Tang Empire. Except 8 years later, his son actually took over the throne as Tang Taizong, who became really kind of the symbol of the Tang dynasty, right? He was a brilliant general, he was a government reformer, he was an historian, he was a master of calligraphy and other Chinese arts as well. So he was really a symbol of all the things that kind of made up the Tang dynasty, and he's probably their most famous emperor. The Tang dynasty, as you know, reunited China for the first time in almost 400 years, right? And they built a really large empire for the time period, and then also brought in other surrounding states like Korea, Vietnam, Tibet, and other places as tributary states. So really they controlled a huge chunk of that Asian continent. Right? They also restored unified government throughout the empire and really extended the reach of the central Chinese government. And also restarted the civil service examinations, which was how people participated in the Chinese government, was you took these examinations and then you became basically a government member or a bureaucrat, right? Okay, some other stuff the Tang rulers did. One thing that was very important was they instituted land reform to weaken some of the people who owned large amounts of land. Because, right, empires don't want other people competing for their power, right? They want to make sure that the government has all the power. So they broke up these huge landholding that many landowners had and redistributed or gave the land back to peasants to farm, right? And that was part of like their pacification strategy, because obviously it made the peasants happy, but then also it got the government more money because the peasants could now pay taxes to the government, right? So it's kind of a multiple way of taking away power from one group, giving more power and happiness to another group, and then also getting more money for themselves. Okay, a rebel general overthrew the last Tang emperor in 907, so about almost exactly 300 years after the beginning of the Tang dynasty. And then in 960, so there was about a 50-year period there where there was no dynasty. 960, the Song dynasty was founded. And it lasted for a little over 300 years, but it did control less territory than the Tang. They weren't as far-reaching or as centralized. However, the Song dynasty is really known for its great wealth and also cultural achievement. So a lot of the arts and architecture, pottery, jewelry, poems, writings that we have from, or that Chinese people and people in the world, right, kind of recognize as Chinese, come from the Song dynasty. Okay, so the economy grew under the Song dynasty for many reasons. One, it encouraged foreign trade and importing goods into China. So from other places, especially in kind of that Asian and Indian Ocean area, right? Like Indonesia, India, like even the African coasts, right? And also like their tributary states, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, all these different places, it was encouraging trade, right? Which definitely grows the economy. And Chinese cities really became centers of trade. The Song were also very inventive, and they improved, and farmers began to produce 2 crops a year instead of just 1. So they would harvest twice a year, which meant that there was much more food, which you could then sell for money, right? And grain was shipped across China and out into the world as well. China had a very ordered and organized society, and that's kind of a thing that unites the Chinese dynasties, is this like organization of society. And as we talked about, like with Confucianism and legalism, right, these kind of strict rules for how you're supposed to act and interact with other people. So under the Tang and Song, the 2 main social classes were the gentry, or landholders. You can kind of think of them as nobles or aristocracy, and then the peasants. Right? The gentry were really focused on learning knowledge and then also engaging in the government through the civil service and the civil service examinations. And the peasants worked the land, obviously, right? Farmed and produced items as well. So those were kind of the 2 main social classes. However, there was kind of like a third in-between class of the merchants who became wealthy, particularly because of this foreign trade, right? However, actually, the merchants in China had a lower social status than peasants. And this was because of the Confucian tradition, which we've talked about, that kind of orders and ranks people. And creating things in Confucianism is higher than selling things, right? So I think in a lot of societies, we kind of think of the pyramid of like peasants at the bottom and then maybe merchants and then nobility, right? But in China, it was actually the other way around, peasants at the bottom, or merchants at the bottom, peasants, and then like the gentry and the government. Families in China valued boys more than girls, and women had kind of a subordinate position in society, right? Women were often administrators for their household, especially like the women who were married into families that owned land, but they could not keep their dowry, which was basically the money or resources that the family pays to marry the woman off. They really couldn't hold on to their own property. And possibly you know about this, but also like the traditional Chinese custom of foot binding emerged during the Song Dynasty. It was practiced for over 1,000 years. I believe there are still people alive who have had their feet bound. And that was really to like limit the woman's ability to leave the home or really participate in society. Okay, so both the Tang and the Song dynasties had very rich traditions of art in painting and sculpture and porcelain and architecture, right? The gentry especially valued painting and calligraphy, which is writing Chinese characters. A lot of art was focused around balance and then also in harmony and harmony with nature. Right? In architecture, we get the pagoda, which if you think about traditional Chinese, like if you think of like what a Chinese building would look like, you'd probably think of the pagoda with like the little rounded or upturned corners, right? And a lot of the sculptors expressed Buddhist themes because of Buddhism was very influential in China during this period. Tang and songwriters also produced very famous works of writing and poetry, as well as philosophy and history, right? Which is one of the reasons that we know so much about Chinese history in comparison to maybe like European history or African history or South American history, is because they had a very strong and still have a very strong written tradition where writing was very important, right? Both historically and then also for art purposes as well. Poetry, in fact, was the most respected form of literature and art among the gentry. And one of the most famous Tang poets was a poet named Li Bao, or Li Bai, or Li Po. I've seen a few different ways of pronouncing his name. And he wrote over 2,000 poems himself that often dealt with sorrow, battle, lamenting the passage of time, harmony of nature. And here's one I really like, called The Green Water, which I'll just read to you. The autumnal moon silently lights the green water, and the girls all row out into the South Lake to gather water lilies. The lotus blooms so charmingly that it seems to whisper and break those girls' hearts with its pale beauty. I think that's a really beautiful poem, obviously translated into English, but still it kind of retains those images and that beauty. And it's very representative of Tang poetry. Okay, under the Tang and Song, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the year, but also China introduced very important technological innovations. And when we talk about like globalization and the travel of inventions across the world, so many of them come from China, and particularly from these two time periods, right? So one was the mechanical clock. Block printing, which was using type like to print instead of writing things out by hand. Gunpowder, huge important invention. The spinning wheel to spin yarn and thread. And then also movable type, which was you could like carve blocks of letters, or in the Chinese case, characters, and then move them around to create different prints of words, so like books, right? So gunpowder, the spinning wheel, books all come from China, and they revolutionized the world, as we'll talk about. Okay, that's it for the notes. Thank you guys so much, and please ask me if you have any questions.